All right. Wonderful. We're up and running. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an associate professor of history at Shepherd University, as well as the director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. Thank you very much for joining us this evening on a topic that I think is of great importance to 18th and 19th century United States history, and in particular, the history of this region. And I should say as a disclaimer at the beginning that we will be talking about enslavement. Some of these topics can be quite difficult, and they are nonetheless central to our American identity, the sort of paradox of American slavery, American freedom that has very much defined some of our nation's struggles are central to our understanding of the past. And so I was particularly interested in this topic and particularly interested in these panelists for a number of different reasons rooted in their specialties. And so what we're going to do is we're going to offer a pretty broad discussion that's going to touch upon academic as well as public history, archaeology, as well as archival sources. And so I'm very excited about that. As we'll discuss today, uncovering the lives of the enslaved can be quite difficult, and you really need a lot of different types of source materials sometimes to get at those perspectives and those experiences. As always, we have very accomplished scholars, and my introductions are always very brief, and I do apologize for that, but for the sake of time, I am brief. But I am happy to welcome an old friend from graduate school, Dr. Tim Fritz. He is an associate professor of history and forthcoming chair of the department, which is going to be a difficult task, at Mount St. Mary's University, just up the road from us. I pass it a couple times a month, and we're planning some exciting bike trips soon. So welcome, Tim. It's nice to see you again. To my right-hand side is Mr. Matthew Greer. And I should say at the beginning, when I was working on a historic resource study for Cedar Creek, Matt was incredibly gracious and helpful in talking about his ongoing research. And indeed, he is a PhD candidate and doctoral student at Syracuse University. He is currently a pre-doctoral fellow at the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, and he has done extensive field work over the past couple of years at Belle Grove. And again, he's been very sharing of his evidence, and so I deeply appreciate that. Familiar face to those of you who've tuned into past programs is my friend, Professor Jonathan Morales. Jonathan is the director of the McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah University, and there he teaches a whole host of classes. And for those of you who haven't been out to Cool Spring, Jonathan and both his students and staff have done fantastic work there. I've been taking my kids there recently for walks, Jonathan, so we're not using it maybe in the exact way it's supposed to be intended, but nonetheless, we see animals and sights of beaver really active along the river. So anyway, it's been fun. And to my lower right-hand side is the executive director of Belle Grove Plantation, Ms. Christine Lays. And Kristen has been, again, very kind to me as I was working on research at Cedar Creek, Belle Grove. She was very forthcoming with archival sources, extremely helpful during the process. And at some point, she invited me down for a talk. And so I deeply appreciate that partnership. And so with that, welcome to you all. As we're going through tonight's presentation, feel free to pose questions. I have two computer screens going here, so that's why I'm going back and forth, and I'll try to address them as they come along. And in fact, I'm gonna make sure that I'm in the right spot here so I can actually see your questions if they do come, and I'm not. And with that, I think what I want to do is start tonight's discussion pretty broadly, because the topic of slavery in general, but the topic of slavery in particular in the Valley, I think, is encrusted in a lot of mythology. And we're talking a bit about this in our earlier discussion. And I think this is embedded in some early secondary sources, some early histories of the region, as well as some continuing I guess, public interpretations or feelings on the subject. But to start us off, I'm going to quote from Jonathan's book, which I will talk about here in a minute. And in early history, the Annals of Augusta County, written by Joseph Waddell, notes that the institution of slavery never had a strong hold in Augusta County. The Scots-Irish had no love for it, referring to slavery, and the German people were generally adverse to it. And I think from that point forward, there has been this idea that somehow the Valley was somehow removed from the rest of Virginia, that the region was somehow unique. And so maybe we can just start off then with some broad ideas or broad experiences in talking about how this mythology has been so tenaciously clung to, and how it has impacted our understanding of this region and the experiences of the enslaved more broadly, if that's fair. So feel free from there to may weigh in, and then after that we'll may dig into some specific points.
Jim, I can go ahead and share some thoughts. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right when you look at sort of the historiography in the Valley. I sort of make the case Waddell is really kind of that one of the first individuals to sort of make this claim. It wasn't as important here and those types of things. And you see that bleed over into books, which, when I came to the Valley in the late 90s, that's sort of the sense that I got. You read, John Wayland, who is sort of an iconic figure among Valley authors and historians. I think about Laura Virginia Hale, local historian from Warren County, Virginia, wrote a massive compilation, 4 Valiant Years, and they all repeat these same statements. Julia Davis in the 1940s in her book Shenandoah repeats a lot of those same claims, and it's just become so integrated into Valley culture and Valley life. And again, it's not really hard to figure out. I mean, the whole idea of making a statement, well, slavery didn't really exist here, wasn't big. All you have to do is look at the census records to understand that 20 to 25% of the population in the Valley were enslaved, particularly in the years leading up to the American Civil War. And it is certainly a challenge. And I know, Kristen, you're on the public history forefront of things, so I don't want to kind of step on your toes at all there, but yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's just this recurring theme over the past 120 years, and that bleeds over into a lot of public interpretation, and it's been kind of passed down from one generation to the next, and it makes it difficult for people when you challenge the paradigm of, well, yeah, actually slavery did exist in the Valley and was a pretty important part of the Shenandoah Valley's economy.
So I can jump in there. So definitely what Jonathan says, a visitor to Belle Grove that's been interested in history has perhaps grown up with this mythology. And then even school children today that visit Belle Grove, they're reading about Virginia slavery in textbooks, but it's all cast in the Tidewater region. So it's really wonderful when we do get a school program to the site. I'll quiz them on what they know of slavery from their school textbook and discussions in class. And I can read a room really quickly of 4th graders and whether their teachers actually really delved into the topic, has stuck just with the textbook, if they have any other information that are coming to them from TV or other means, whether their family travels. And usually it's a very rudimentary understanding, and it's a belief that happened elsewhere. So even just to start introducing that, no, actually in the room where you're sitting, we had enslaved workers, starts to break that down.
I can jump in briefly as well. I think this is a really important conversation, a valuable conversation to have. And one reason that is because recently in the historiographical trends of place studies over the last 2 decades or so, looking at regions that's distinctly connected to other regions, but also maintaining that local and distinct character of their own. And so what does that mean to look at the Valley as it connects to other places and have that place not necessarily be the Tidewater. And so in looking at the valley as what it is, a transportation corridor, what does that mean? Who was there, who passed through? And so even though something might not necessarily be reflected in maybe the folklore of the region, does not mean that passersby or people who were involved, or people who set foot in the place or may have spent the night someplace else, are any less important to the story of the region. And so it's always good to have that perspective, I think.
And I think, if I may, just to add on to what Tim said, I mean, visitors themselves in the 18th and 19th century notice it distinctly. I mean, it comes up in a lot of the travel narratives, especially if they're visitors from Europe or from the North. And so it was very apparent to many 18th and 19th century people passing through the region, even if the story itself gets lost over time. And I also do want to take this opportunity to say that the historiography is expanding, and we actually do have an author this evening, Jonathan Morales, who has recently published a book through the University Press of Florida titled Slavery and Freedom in the Shenandoah Valley During the Civil War Era. In the comments section of the Facebook page, I provided a link to the press page as well as a discount code, which is AHA21, and that code is good through June the 30th. And so, Jonathan, congratulations. All of us here have written, and we know it can be an onerous task. And when it's completed, there's nothing quite like it. I do actually, we have a question here. So if you don't mind, I am going to bounce over here to one of the questions. And again, we can keep this broad before we start to drill down into your respective areas of expertise, but someone notes, rightfully so, that the valley is actually quite unique. Not only is it a region of mixed agriculture, but it's also a region that has many iron furnaces. And so can you all speak perhaps to how the role of mixed agriculture and industrialization impacts race and slavery in the region? So excellent question, thank you, from our audience.
Yes, if you all don't mind, I can go ahead and start. So there's this view that sort of comes up over and over again that when you have mixed agriculture, you tend not to have slavery because the labor requirements are different. But when we actually drill down and look at the daily agricultural tasks that people were doing in mixed agriculture, there's work in the fields being done year round, except for the wintertime when you have other work being done. So slavery fits in with mixed agriculture surprisingly well. I think, but with this common conception that it doesn't. And that's part of the reason why I think that the myth that there wasn't a lot of slavery in the Shenandoah Valley is so persistent, is that right before you get the New School of Social History, you have a shift in the historiography in the Shenandoah Valley that starts talking about the lack of slavery, not in terms of ethnic or religious reasons, but in terms of mixed agriculture. So I think that it's all mixed into with the mythology.
If I may too jump in briefly, I think it's important to realize that a lot of this, at least in the travel narratives and things of the time, people who notice the mixed agriculture and the industrial, part of this is the embedded idea that people of African descent do not have the capacity to engage in anything else but agriculture, which is simply not the truth. And so the idea that you would have enslaved folks in more skilled positions, such as working at the tannery, working at the hemp factory, making the rope, or even involved, in light pig iron production, that was a very normal thing, especially, I know I'm getting out of the valley for a second, but in Baltimore, you have those, iron furnaces sort of early on there, and they were primarily populated by enslaved Africans. And so I think part of that is just not being able to reconcile the fact that enslaved people can be put in a variety of jobs and moving past this vision of enslaved folks only working on a field or on a farm.
Yeah, and also, if I can add, one of the things that sort of courses throughout my book is the great use of enslaved laborers at these iron furnaces. A lot of the owners of these furnaces renting out enslaved laborers from individuals within the valley, and of course beyond. And it's also interesting, you talked about Tim and Jim spoke about travel narratives and about their awareness of slavery in the valley. You also see, I mean, newspapers in the 1840s are like newspapers in Richmond are making connections and saying, wow, the Shenandoah Valley is starting to look a lot more like us in terms of the number of enslaved people, the myriad ways that enslaved laborers are being used. And also, if I could just sort of add there, you know, going back to the idea of mythology, one of the things that I know every single one of us on this screen has heard before is that, well, if slavery did exist, it looked different in the Valley. Slaves were treated better. And, you know, I mean, it's hard to sort of quantify how much physical abuse there has been. But if you look at the extant narratives, I'm thinking about John Quincy Adams, who was enslaved in Frederick County, Elizabeth Veney, who wrote a very well-known popular narrative. She was from Page County, Virginia. You know, they noted that, yeah, they had the material things to survive, but they weren't, they were still enslaved. They recognized that individuals had suzerainty, they had control over them. And, you know, as Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote, the thing itself is abusive. You know, and I think that's what people lose sight of sometimes when they're thinking about, well, slavery, it's some kind of benevolent institution in the Valley.
Yeah, back to the iron furnaces quickly. This is one of the classic debunkers, is that there were different ethnicities and different religious practices in the Valley that were abhorrent to slavery. One of the biggest local iron producers in the early 1800s, the late 1700s, was Isaac Zane, who was a Quaker, and so that's a quick answer to, you know, Quakers didn't believe in slavery. His story is more complex than just that, but it's a good example. And then Belle Grove gets this all the time. I just even had a local high school teacher reach out for me to do a program to try to bring the local context to our students, which I appreciated. But even she started hinting around the edges, because wasn't it better here? Wasn't it nicer? And that was just all the fuel I needed to start really honing in. Like, yeah, there were enslaved people at Belle Grove Plantation that were there for 5 generations. How nice is that, you know, to know that you're bringing a child into the world and into this condition of which there's no escape. And we have multiple examples along those lines.
Yeah, thank you all. I mean, I think that's a good beginning. Let me switch our view here again. I think what might be useful to do at this point is to get a bit of a bird's eye view and gain some altitude here. And so we're going to try to keep this flowing as it's been going, because I like the vibe, but each of you does have a degree of specialization. And so I was hoping to direct the conversation in a couple different ways, and we'll just keep kind of weighing in as we have done so. And look in the questions. I'm going to save that one, put a pin in that, but we'll come back to that. But Tim, if you could start us off by just giving us some broader information about, you know, how as you said earlier, how we can situate this place within the broader context of 18th and 19th century Virginia. You know, what is the place of the Valley? And it's just some rough maybe demographics. Just give us some sense of you know, again, how enslaved peoples are distributed and how this region compares and contrasts.
Yeah, sure. And so, you know, obviously, I think most of us recognize that the bulk of enslaved folks in Virginia were based in the Tidewater region. That's normal, especially throughout other, you know, mid-Atlantic and southern states. That's where the money initially is in different sorts of cash crops. And I think the big understanding, at least public perception perhaps, of slavery is that it's based around cash crop agriculture. It exists only because there are ways to create luxury goods by which you would make money very quickly, whether that be sugar, whether that be tobacco, in Virginia's case, rice or cotton. The idea is, the belief is that you make money and that's why you do it. But I think when you look a little bit beyond that, you have to begin to think about economic reliance from the coastwise trade of the goods that are produced. And then also the processing of said materials, like we were saying before. You pick the tobacco, and then what? You work at, pick the cotton, and then what? What about the textiles? What about the sawmills? And so there's substantial enslaved labor in both the refinement of the raw material, as well as the transport and delivery of said materials. So it's important to realize that slavery is embedded across all ends of the production spectrum. They are at every step of the process, not simply the extraction or the agricultural process. And then we see people begin to bring enslaved folks into the valley around 1750-ish. We start to see a tobacco pop up actually on Algonquin in 1744, roughly. And so that's another thing I want to point out. Just because it's mixed agriculture does not mean that people didn't try harsher things. It just didn't work. And I'm sure folks would have very much liked to have grown tobacco, and many Eastern planters did come out and try that with mixed success, of course. But there was that desire to replicate certain aspects. But when it became more clear that that land was going to be settled by a variety of different European folks coming into these different land grants and land grants being sold off, you have much more of a community house-based agriculture where folks didn't own very many slaves. I think it ends up being, around 25,000 shortly before. But with that being said, I think it's important to remember that the act of slavery is something that is both external and internal. It's the idea that people are legally barred from seeking their autonomy. And so no matter how you look at it, when other people are coming to the valley, they are achieving their goals of autonomy. There's plentiful land, there's all these resources, and people talk about the soil and the resources and the travel narratives of all this beautiful space. These people want nothing. They go and they grow, and there's all this trade, and they can send it back on these roads. That's true. But at the same time, enslaved people don't look at the same situation the same way. They are prohibited from living a full life. And so in that, I want to point out something about sort of the valley's connection to the rest of slavery, the rest of, at least in the colonies in the early republic as well. We notice on some of these census things in like 1820, some folks have in their counties majority female slaves, many of those enslaved people being under the age of 17. What that usually suggests to me in my research is unfortunately some sort of breeding operation. And we know that the slave pens in Alexandria, Virginia were extremely profitable. It's well documented that many people were purchasing female enslaved people for the purpose of creating more enslaved people, which they would then bring into town in Alexandria to be sold like that. And so when you think about the mixed agriculture and the mixed product, it's not just the hemp and the flax and the other things. It's also literally a site for the production of human material to be commodified and sent out into the broader slave trade. That was a huge part of the business in the valley, is breeding and creating slaves to take to Alexandria to sell. And that's just one way. When we think about the outflow of those individuals, I'll pull up an image here briefly, if I may. All right. And so this is an image of what roughly some people call the enslaved Trail of Tears. Over 450,000 people between 1810 and 1850 were trafficked through the valley on their way to southern sites, places deeper in the south. Obviously, some folks went from Alexandria coastwise and rode boats down further south, but a lot of people were sold in Alexandria, taken out to Winchester, then taken down the Valley Road to other places in Tennessee and further down, definitely during the time period of Tennessee's founding expansion into the Old Southwest as that began to take off, early in the 19th century. And so, what I was saying earlier, it's important to realize that folks pass through who experience things different than those who stayed. That does not mean that the folks who did pass through are any less valuable or important to the story. How do we reckon with the almost 500,000 enslaved people who traveled the valley and in a forced march essentially towards the more cash crop locations in the South. And so even if the Valley did display a mixed agriculture economy, there were many people passing through who were dedicated to those cash crops and who were very bound to that economic system. And the Valley made a lot of money off those travelers and a lot of money by breeding folks to be going into that system in the first place. And so those are just some things I wanted to point out. I'll stop it there. We can discuss.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, that's I think some important context. And for those of you who are posing questions, thank you. If we don't get to all of them, I promise I'll switch our view again. I promise that I'll go back into the Facebook chat and try to address them, but I'm going to try to do a little bit of juggling here and see if I can't pose some of these questions to you all. And one's going to be easy, but there is a broad question before I get to a specific one about the autonomy of the enslaved, especially as related to regional and local economies. And I will say briefly, although this book doesn't focus in on the lower valley, the best work to my knowledge is still Dylan Penningroth's Claims of Kinfolk. And what Dylan argues in that work is that there's a great degree of autonomy in terms, and Matt could probably speak to this actually, a great deal of autonomy in terms of maintaining gardens, trafficking some goods in an informal economy. In some instances, enslaved peoples accumulate over periods of time sums of money large enough, using the period terminology, to purchase themselves, to self-emancipate, self-liberate. And I think if you look at the legal systems of the period, this is all prohibited, but we know in fact, largely through some interesting detective work dealing with some post-war records, and then I think, again, Matt might be able to speak to this a bit about the archaeology, that in fact there is a very vibrant informal economy. To broaden it out, do any of you have specific anecdotes or knowledge of the movement of enslaved peoples around the lower valley, for instance, going into Winchester for the purchase of goods? But I think that was generally I think the gist of the question. So I'll open that one up and then I'll turn it to Kristen for a specific one, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so that's some of the research that I've been doing in my work, trying to trace out the movement of enslaved people throughout the region to buy and sell things, using a combination of merchants' ledgers and ceramic analysis. And one of the things that I'm seeing is that over time, enslaved people's ability to go to cities and towns and country stores becomes increasingly restricted. And this means that enslaved people are being pushed out of, or at least sort of marginalized within the local economy in the Shenandoah Valley. And a lot of this has to do with this paranoia that increases throughout the 19th century that enslavers have, that if enslaved people have access to money and access to especially alcohol, then they will become disorderly, and that could disrupt slavery. So that's one thing that we are seeing in the Shenandoah Valley.
Thank you. Good. Yeah, no, I think that's both a broad and then a specific context is quite useful. We have a more specific question that will sort of move us into Kristen. And so one of our viewers has been to Belle Grove, which is excellent. And as things continue to open up and you can safely do so, we always encourage you, of course, to go to local historic sites. The humanities right now needs a lot of love and help. But the question pertained to how your specific site interprets the experiences of the enslaved, and more broadly, how audiences have received that story. And so if you could speak first to that, and then maybe we can drill down into the experiences in particular of the Height family, which were in residence there for some period of time. So maybe we could do a public history take and then a bit of a primary source take.
Yeah, glad to do that. So thanks for visiting Belle Grove. We are open now, doing tours Wednesday through Sunday, but starting June 1st, we'll be offering tours daily. We use volunteers. We have a very small paid staff, and we're heavily reliant on volunteers. And most of our volunteers are retirees. At this time, they are all white. And so there's been a big learning curve to try to introduce the history of enslavement at Belle Grove into their knowledge. And many of them will tell me, I never learned any of this in school. I grew up in Virginia. Why didn't we ever learn this in school? And some take that as sort of clarion call, that a mission that they want to help be a public historian to sort of change that narrative, which I appreciate. Others still have some nervousness about it. And so we've done multiple trainings. One thing that was really important that we just did on the site to just get us started, and I've been at Belle Grove 8 years, and this has been a primary mission of mine. The African-American history of the site has been a primary mission of mine the whole time. But just even getting some markers on the site, so some signage that talk about the history of enslavement, whether you're just coming on for a picnic, that you'll see that. In other opportunities, we had a restoration of a building and had some opportunities for exhibit panels, making sure the story of enslavement was woven through those exhibit panels was very important. And then in a space we have on the lower level of the manor house, where it was a working space, we started to just put up some simple exhibit panels talking about slavery in our research. And although our research is ongoing constantly, this was just, again, a way to bring people into the work. I think a lot of people just expect us to know, full biographies of enslaved individuals. And there were 276 men, women, and children held in bondage at Belle Grove between the 1780s and the 1850s. And there are very few narratives that we can tell about that. So some visitors fully expect that they're going to hear that. And that had been a myth among our docents is, well, we don't know much, so why mention it at all? So that was a big thing to break. We do know a lot. Another pitfall we ran into was discussing the enslaved in very cold ways, in very ways of just, numbers, even saying 276, as opposed to telling you a story about Judah, one of the enslaved cooks, or Daniel, one of the blacksmiths. As Tim said, a tremendous amount of talent. I can share my screen and show you a couple of the documents that we have. I'm just going to go full screen here. So this is a view of what we see today. The barns are more modern, but this little cottage in the foreground was Isaac Height's office, and we think a storage room and possibly a retail operation. As Tim is saying, Isaac Height is going, selling his goods, having enslaved people take his goods to markets in Alexandria. He's got contacts in Jamaica. He's buying sugar from them. He's selling them flour. He's a multifaceted businessman. He has multiple industries on the property. There's a sawmill, a grist mill, a distillery. This is a grain plantation, though exactly as Tim said, they tried tobacco early on and it did not go anywhere. And so the Heights had come from Pennsylvania down the Valley Pike. They were German, again, busting the myth that Germans didn't have enslaved workers. Yost Height was Isaac Height's grandfather, one of the first European Americans to settle the area. And we think by the second generation, by Yost's children's generation, that they became enslavers. So this is a document, an example of the documents we have that Isaac Height kept about his enslaved workers, and some titles on the headers are names of my Negro, when born, how disposed. So we have the name of the individual, in parentheses, their mother's name, usually because the mother's also owned by the Height family, their birth date, and then in the far right column, sometimes another note where the person was bought from or sold from. Absolutely, to Tim's point, we are seeing high numbers of births at Belle Grove. I think the highest number in the census is 1810. We have 103 enslaved people noted in the census. In 1820, it's 101. And just the percentage of children under, or individuals under the age of 17 is kind of astounding. It's like 30 to 40%. And Isaac Height's a smart businessman. There's to talk about it in a very commercial way, a very harsh way. You're not going to get the labor out of a younger person that you are a very skilled person in their 20s or 30s. And so this just seems to me evidence that there could have been slave breeding at Belle Grove. And I can stop it there. We can go into more detail as you wish.
One of the things that I always say when visiting a historic site, and different historic sites have different ways that you interface with them. Some are tightly guided tours where you don't have a lot of autonomy. Others, you have the ability to sort of use the spaces at your own time and pace. And I would urge people when they do go into one of these large plantations, think about the spaces. Think about how you're entering the space. This is the front area is a space reserved for primarily white visitors. Yeoman farmers may not even be admitted into the main doors. But then think about, as Kristen said, something like the basement space or the downstairs. This is in Belle Grove, and it's a huge cooking facility. The heat, the smoke. And try to reorient yourself in these spaces. And I think some sites, and Belle Grove is among them, has done a lot to try to reorient the visitors. And more famously, the example of someplace like Monticello. Monticello still maintains a pre-traditional guided tour, but they've supplemented that tour now with the Mulberry Road tour. I mean, at some point, it'd be nice to have a more holistic vision of the entire plantation. But I guess I would just, as an aside, urge you our audience, when visiting these sites, to think about these spaces in different ways and think about the different types of social classes and racial groups, how they used these arenas. And I think it can really force you to rethink the place. And today too, we have the problem of maybe the landscapes aren't preserved, but again, I would encourage you to go to Belle Grove. Belle Grove still maintains, I think, a vista that is very reminiscent of that of the period, and you can get some sense of the size and scale. You have the main thoroughfare right there, and so just some additional thoughts as you visit these places. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? I know, Matt, you've done a lot of archaeological work there, which we can turn to in a minute, but just any more broad observations, Tim or Jonathan? Okay. So, okay. Okay. Well, and one of our guests has also added some other sites, including Somerset Plantation near Edenton. Again, that's an exquisite site. It's been a number of years since I've been there, but they do absolutely fantastic work. So thank you again for the comments, and I'll continue to sort of interweave them into our discussion as we go along. At this point, though, I do want to turn it over to Matt. And both Kristen and Tim, I think, have spoke very nicely about the possibilities, but also the constraints with the archival record. And having done a lot of work in this area myself, you do want to extract these very detailed stories in ways that are just simply impossible for non-literate populations, Black or white, in the 18th and 19th centuries. But I think one of the great possibilities remains the archaeological record. And I always encourage my students to think broadly about evidence, think about buildings, think about artifacts and museums, think about material culture, but then think too, which of course is part of all this, the archaeology. And Matt's done some exquisite work. And so I'd like to turn it over to him. And he could talk a little bit about the day-to-day experiences of the enslaved at Belle Grove, and he can show us some of the pieces that he's found. And again, I just want to give him one more shout out. He was very gracious to me when I was doing a historic resource study and shared everything that he had, and it helped me entirely rethink what I was doing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Jim. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. And of course, the PowerPoint just disappeared. Let me try that again. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and start talking and pull that up in a second. So I started doing archaeological research at Belle Grove in 2015. And over the course of the next 5 years after that, between 2015 and 2019, we did extensive excavations at the main quartering site at Belle Grove, which we today call Quarter Site B. If you've been to Belle Grove, that site is located just across the street from the Manor House. Here we go. Can everyone see that? Awesome. Okay. So the site is circled here. And so over the years that we did the work there, we excavated a log cabin that was inhabited from around 1800 to about 1850, that unfortunately burned. We also excavated some outdoor fire pits and trash scatters, and we found over 50,000 artifacts. We're still processing all the artifacts now. And one of the major through lines in all the artifacts that we are seeing is the role of hunger in enslaved life in the Shenandoah Valley. So Virginia enslavers generally gave enslaved men 2 gallons of cornmeal and 3.5 pounds of salted pork per week. Sometimes they gave women the same amount of food, but oftentimes it was less. And this gave enslaved people about 3,200 calories per day. But unfortunately for enslaved farmers, for most of the year, for most people, this was nowhere near enough food. Depending on the different enslaved people, they might have needed between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day during the wheat harvest, for instance. So they were thousands of calories short of what they needed. So hunger is a very critical thing. It's important to realize here that there was enough food to feed the enslaved people. Belle Grove was a mixed agricultural plantation. It was a wheat plantation. They could have fed everyone, but oftentimes you see enslavers choosing to make a little bit of extra money by not feeding enslaved people. And this was probably happening at Belle Grove too. And one of the things that we're seeing at the site is that enslaved people did a lot of extra work to feed themselves, to make up for this lack of food they were being given. And enslaved people at the site were raising poultry, especially chickens and ducks and guinea fowl. And they're also hunting in the woods around Belle Grove, both larger mammals like deer, but also things like rabbits and squirrels and turtles. Enslaved people were also gathering plants from the woods around Belle Grove, such as walnuts and wild plums, and growing things like extra corn for themselves. And through all this extra work that enslaved people were doing at night and on what little time they had to themselves, they were, it seems like, able very seasonal crops. They're only available certain times of the year. So if you want to stave off hunger in the wintertime, you need to find a way to extend this extra food into the winter. So we know that some enslaved people were buying extra sugar in the wintertime to get extra calories for themselves. But other people at Belle Grove seem to have turned to ceramics to sort of preserve this food. And we have found over 10,000 ceramic sherds at Belle Grove. And a lot of them are locally made utilitarian vessels, things like these ceramics you see on the screen here. And these were important for day-to-day life. And this is a picture of what these would have looked like when they were whole. These aren't from Belle Grove, these are from an auction elsewhere in the valley. But they give you a sense of what these vessels look like. And a lot of these are crocks and jars. In fact, we have found at least 38 crocks and jars. And what crocks and jars were used for was storing food. So before you had Tupperware, before you had glass mason jars or any other glass jars, if you wanted to make preserves or pickles, you needed a crock or a jar. And the fact that we're seeing so many of these at Belle Grove suggests that enslaved people were using these to help stave off hunger during times of the years when they didn't have extra crops growing to stave off this hunger. And this is all really important, I think, to bring up because it contradicts this myth we have that slavery in the Valley was more benign, because we see enslavers like the Heights inflicting this gastronomic violence on enslaved people by choosing not to give them enough food. And this also shows us how enslaved people were finding ways to get around this violence and to make lives for themselves. And what we do see later in the 19th century, enslavers cutting off enslaved people's access to be able to buy things from local merchants. This is not only cutting off their ability to make kinship ties with one another, as Dylan Pendergraft talks about, but also cutting off their ability to survive slavery itself. So that is what I had for y'all.
One of the thank you, Matt. I think that's perfect. One of the things that I want to speak to real quick, and maybe we can broaden this back out again. So if you go to Belle Grove, the one thing that you won't see are the quarters of the enslaved. And this is actually pretty common among many historic sites. Even Mulberry Row has a recreated quarter, but by and large, it's the archaeological remnants. And so I guess maybe can we talk about that for a minute? I mean, so, you know, how does this impact one's ability in the classroom or at historic sites to talk about the day-to-day lived realities when so much of that lived experience is essentially now off the landscape? You know, I guess what challenges and what possibilities are there? I know it's a broad question, but it's something that I've been thinking about, and it's something that you know, Matt in particular has done a lot of work on.
So I can just introduce it, but I want to toss it to Matt, back to Matt. So you're exactly right. So when you visit Belle Grove, if we didn't have some signage, if we didn't have a docent that would bring up slavery, most people visit, you know, they come off the highway and they want just a nice experience. They might not have even had slavery on their mind. I mean, some, obviously the word plantation in our name is a big giveaway. But you're right, you don't see it on the landscape. And so it's easy to dismiss. So as your earlier point was, you know, you have to envision the spaces and where the enslaved worked. You have to bring that story into every room of the house because it was in every room of the house. So the big question is, would we rebuild enslaved quarters like Monticello has, like Montpelier has? And I really have a lot of different feelings on that. I considered that sort of a focus group question. I want to hear from a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds what they think. My hesitancy is still has to be a structure that is safe, that withstands weather, and thereby we're going to be building it stronger than it probably was. That the chance to build something very accurate, I think, would be a challenge. And then I've heard mixed things about sites that have those recreations, that visitors really can miss the point. They walk in them and say, oh, this wasn't so bad. Or I was watching a tiny home program and they just had this much space. That really misses the point. So, but Matt and I have some partners who, one possible solution to this would be a virtual reality project. So I'm going to toss it back to Matt to talk a little bit about a project we're working on that uses that.
Yeah, so we've partnered with Dr. Dave Hickson from Hood College and Shepherd, and he is working with Jeffrey Badala, who I believe is at Penn right now. I might be getting that wrong. I do apologize if he's watching this and I am wrong. And they are taking they did 3D scans of the plantation, and they use that to make a virtual 3D model, and then they're removing all the modern buildings on the landscape. There's a lot of 20th century construction, and trying to put back in reconstructed buildings that we found archaeologically. And I think this has a big advantage for us right now over rebuilding physical buildings, because we simply don't know a lot about the buildings that we're working on and where other buildings were located. So the advantage of this is if we realize in 5 years that we are wrong about something, it could take an afternoon to fix it rather than tear down the building and rebuild it back in its entirety. You can also still get visitors to see what the view sheds would have looked like and see what the plantation would have looked like with these buildings on the landscape.
Yeah, thank you. I just, again, it's one of the challenges of this, and something that I thought, be worthy of comment. I think to bring this around into one of the earlier points, we talked about how visitors interacted, or at least viewed the enslaved while passing through the valley. But moving into the Civil War era, we have large numbers of Union soldiers coming into the region. And so maybe Jonathan can start us off here. But I think it would be useful for our audience to hear a bit about one, the wartime environment, and then two, as much as possible in the time that we have, the lives of newly freed African Americans moving into the era of 1865 and beyond. And then Jonathan and maybe Tim, it looks like you're nodding too, so you want to weigh in maybe a bit. But I'll turn first over to Jonathan. Is that getting down the, okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, to sort of really summarize things quickly here, African Americans enslaved as well as free blacks in the Valley during the Civil War, I think they navigated an impossible world. The Valley, particularly, the lower Shenandoah Valley, the northern part of the Valley, is in a constant state of flux. One day it's Confederate, one day it's Union, one day it's in a no man's land. And really, one of the things I read about in the book is there's always this desire for enslaved people to be free, but there's constant friction between that and the desire to survive the war. And so, it's not just an easy decision to say, hey, I want to be free and I'm going to run away and I'm going to achieve my freedom. And I do want to share real quick this story, because again, one of the things that I frequently hear, and I'm certain others here at various historic sites, is again this idea of the happy, contented slave. And if you look, for instance, at this story, so for those of you who are familiar with Winchester, the building you see there on the screen is Hawthorne, which is the McDonald family home. It still stands off Amherst Street today. And in the spring of 1862, when Nathaniel P. Banks occupied Winchester, there were literally every single day scores and scores and scores of enslaved as well as free blacks seeking protection with General Banks's army. And one of those individuals who fled, sought protection, was an enslaved man, enslaved by the McDonalds. His name was Manuel. So Manuel, from March until late May of 1862, he worked as a teamster for General Banks's army. And then you get to that moment, May 25th, First Battle of Winchester. Banks was defeated by Stonewall Jackson, is hastening out of Winchester. And you have this large group of African Americans following General Banks's army. One of them was Manuel. And Manuel got to a point several miles north of Winchester, stopped his wagon, abandoned it, and he made his way back into Winchester. And ultimately, he ends up reuniting with Cornelia McDonald and her family. And individuals will look at this story and then, they'll say, well, Manuel, this is a great example of the loyalty of an enslaved person to an enslaver. And, McDonald, she writes about this in her diary. And, she writes that he was so repentant and didn't want to leave and promises he'll never do it again. But then when you look at the rest of the story, it's pretty clear that he came back because he's worried, well, what's going to happen to my wife, Catherine? What's going to happen to my child? And then September 1862 comes along. General Julius White evacuates Winchester, and Manuel, Catherine, and the child, they take the McDonald carriage and they get out of Winchester, never to return. So, it's a very, very complex environment where enslaved people have to figure out, do I want to be free, but how am I going to survive? And there's just a lot of this back and forth that's going on. And also the issues of who do I trust? And there's this sort of evolution as the war goes on. Robert Patterson, when he was in the Valley in the summer of 1861, largely in Berkeley County, Virginia, now what's Berkeley County, West Virginia, he is implementing federal policy which doesn't allow Union soldiers to help enslaved people seek freedom. And so he's implementing the letter of the law, and he's either returning freedom seekers to their enslavers, or he's locking them up in the jail in Martinsburg. And then, of course, as the war evolves, policy changes, First Confiscation Act, Emancipation Proclamation, those types of things, and it becomes a bit easier for enslaved people to get away. But it's a very, very difficult environment, and an almost impossible environment. And then, when you get to that post-war era, for African Americans who remained, again, they're trying to navigate this world, trying to realize freedom's totality in a place where, quite frankly, the large majority of white people don't want them to realize all that freedom has to offer. And so one of the things that really sticks with me from years of research is testimony that was given by a fellow named Watkins James. He was from Frederick County, Virginia, before the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. And he was asked by this committee, this congressional committee, what is the attitude of former Confederates toward Black people in the Northern Shenandoah Valley? And James stated, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he said that the hatred toward Blacks in the Valley is greater today, so this is the post-war period, than it was during the conflict. And so, that hatred is existing because the whole social order has changed. I think a formerly enslaved person walking around is a daily reminder of your defeat. And that's something that's very difficult to take. And so, the Valley, I don't think it's as perpetually violent as other places in the South, but it is certainly unsettled, and there is violence that occurs. I mean, there's a lot of instances of freedmen's schools being broken into, both during day school and night school, where individuals are just trying to disrupt the educational process, threatening teachers, threatening students. And so, yeah, I think both during the war and after, it's this impossible environment that they're trying to navigate.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Thank you. The Reconstruction era is incredibly complex, and the degrees of violence do vary, but the overall sort of sinister shift, the disfranchisement of African Americans, the beginnings of Jim Crow by the 1890s is casts a shadow across the entirety of the American South. And again, I would encourage you to go to Jonathan's book. He did a lot of really, I think, smart research in the Freedmen's Bureau records, which they're difficult to navigate. I've spent many dozens of hours in them, but they're also just incredibly revealing documents. And and Jonathan did a very nice job in extracting, I think, some real jewels. In the comments section, I've added some links for Belle Grove. We deeply appreciate those that will give you some more insights into not only the virtual programming, but also the research, the ongoing research about the lives of the enslaved. And again, Jonathan's book is featured in the chat as well. And for those of you who are looking to purchase it through the University Press of Florida, which I would encourage you to do, please use promotion code AHA21 for the discount. So what I want to do to wrap this up and give each of you one more moment here to speak is, it's hard to believe that was an hour, it went so quickly, is I want to give you an opportunity to either recommend to our viewers a specific book that I think could speak to race and slavery broadly, or something specific on the Valley that you can deem essential. Or I'll give this an option, or if there's something that you really want them to know that hasn't been said, is there some interpretive point some major takeaway that you can offer that you want them to go with, or you can combine both of them. And I'm going to start, if it's okay, with Tim. And again, feel free to take this in any direction you want, but we'll kind of use this as our wrap up.
Sure. I did have a book. I'm writing a review of it right now, but of course it's not directly in front of me. So maybe we'll get back to that. But I will say, the one thing I guess that everyone should remember is that resources span the spectrum in early America and in the early republic. And those resources go from mixed agriculture goods to industrial goods, and also to humans themselves. And so anytime we think about slavery, as cold as it is, the production of enslaved people themselves are a huge part of it. And that is something that's going to be there no matter how many or what the demographics of the area are. The demographics of a particular area, the amount of enslaved folks you have isn't going to change anything about cultures of violence, cultures of sexual violence. Even if there were only 10, it's still the production of humans for the intent to sell. Was a big thing in Shenandoah Valley, and it's connected to what was going on in the rest of the world. So for all of its distinctness, it is still very much connected to, and the aspirations of those who engage in such business are still on par with the aspiration of anyone else in Virginia, even if the lived everyday experience might look a little bit different than the Tidewater.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Matt, since you're to my right, if it's okay.
Yeah, so the one book that I would recommend, this is not on the Valley, but it is, I think, if you are interested in thinking about what archaeology can contribute to these, if you're not used to thinking about archaeological data, the book is Subfloor Pits and the Archaeology of Slavery in Colonial Virginia by Patricia Samford. And that does a really good job of looking at essentially tiny root cellars that you commonly see throughout Virginia. And we see these at Belle Grove. And by looking at this one type of cellar, what we can learn about enslaved food, enslaved religion, about the process of Africans becoming African Americans, and all of these larger trends, and how we can see these through just one type of hole in the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kristen?
Yep. So 2 books, again, they don't deal with this, the Valley. And so you do have to sort of take our word for that they're relevant. And Tim's made these great points. Is The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist. If you want to understand how just completely embedded the system of enslavement was throughout the country and throughout the economy and throughout the creation of this country, that leaves no doubt when you finish that book. And then The American Slave Coast, which talks about what Tim, and that's by, let's see, Ned Sublette and Constance Sublette, husband and wife team. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. And that talks about this concept of slave breeding, but also that internal slave trade that I think has gotten I don't know if it really has gotten the attention more broadly that it deserves. And there's no doubt that the Valley was that conduit. I mean, modern day Route 11, which was the Valley Pike, ends at New Orleans. So that you can never forget that. But that book also just talks about just how completely embedded slavery was into the U.S. economy and even into the credit market.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of really interesting scholarship coming down on that. So thank you. Jonathan, yeah, please.
Well, I know it would be in poor taste to recommend my own, so I won't do that. Yeah, I think there's a book that really struck me, Joseph Wrighty's Illusions of Emancipation. I think kind of shows this, again, emancipation isn't one moment, it's in a constant state of flux, constant back and forth. And again, that provides a really, really broad perspective on things. And also, again, not specific to the Valley, but certainly it ties in as Jaime Amanda Martinez, Confederate slave impressment in the Upper South. And one of the things that individuals oftentimes forget about is, during the Civil War, it's not just enslaver and enslaved, it's Confederate soldiers taking human resources to build defenses around Richmond. And that's such a wonderful, wonderful book. And if you're looking for something specific to the Valley, Sarah Jane Foster's diary, published by UVA Press a number of years ago. She was a school teacher from Maine, came down, taught at the Freedman School in Martinsburg. And it's just a horrific environment for her to teach and for her students to learn. And I think it really shed some light on what the educational experience for African Americans is like in that post-war era.
Perfect, thank you. And just to reiterate, Illusions of Emancipation is now the definitive account. It's just an exquisite book. It's crafted thematically in really innovative ways. Matt, I'm sorry, can you repeat your book? We had a question on the chat there.
Yeah, so it is Subfloor Pits and the Archaeology of Slavery in Colonial Virginia.
Awesome. And I'll give my two. I don't know when to do this, but The Hemingses of Monticello by Annette Gordon-Reed. Phenomenal book, really imaginative, deeply researched, just gave profound insights, I thought, between the relationship between the enslaved and the enslaver. Just really innovative book. I read it twice and I was just profoundly taken by it. And I think one of the most thorough studies of 18th century slavery is Slave Counterpoint by Philip Morgan, in which he compares slavery in the Chesapeake Tidewater region with that of the South Carolina Low Country. It's big. It's a big read. Both of them are actually, they're both long books, but both are just incredibly well researched and beautifully written as well. So with that, to our audience, thank you. I think we got to most of your questions, but if we didn't, I first apologize. It was no intentional neglect. I'll try to go back into the comments or the next day or two and fill in where I may have missed anything, missed something, but we deeply appreciate everything that you've contributed. You're kind of a lively audience, which I love. And to my panelists, thank you. I always feel so bad asking people after a long day to work more, but it was a very enjoyable conversation, and just the insights were quite incredible. So thank you all very much. I deeply appreciate it. So with that, we'll go ahead and close out for the evening. To everyone, I hope you stay healthy and well. And again, as we begin to reopen things, please to go out and visit sites like Cool Spring and Belle Grove. There's going to be some more scholarship coming out from this group, I'm almost positive. So stay tuned. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening.